Have you ever wondered why Cirrus pilots are encouraged to use the CAPS parachute rather than glide down to a field? And do you know why Cirrus pilots are at greater risk of dying than, say, Cessna pilots if they do attempt to put their airplane into a field? On Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, there were two engine failures, one in a Cirrus SR22T near Shelbyville, Indiana, and another in a Cessna 172 in Florida, and both aircraft landed in a field. In a moment, I'll tell you why the two pilots in the Cirrus died, while the Cessna pilot walked away. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. I've also been a Cirrus CSIP instructor for 18 years and have about 5,000 hours of experience teaching in Cirrus aircraft. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. If you're new to this show, take a moment right now, touch the subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Last week in episode 302, we talked about the fatal crash of a Cessna P210 that occurred near San Diego. If you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/302. And this is a listener-supported show, so if you learned something from this show, please sign up and join the club to help support the show at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Let's talk first about the SR22T crash in Shelbyville, and later we'll talk about why Cirrus pilots should use their parachute after an engine failure instead of gliding the plane down to a field. But first, my condolences to the friends and family of the two pilots who died in this crash. It really was a tragic accident, though it appears it could have been avoided. Like all accidents, we talk about them to learn from them, to become safer pilots, and to avoid having a similar accident. The plane that crashed, November 17 Delta Tango, was a 2019 SR22T. According to a friend, it was sold to a new owner on Sunday, just 3 days before the crash. Here's the history of the flights by the new owner. On Sunday, the aircraft left Greenville, South Carolina at about 12:30 p.m. for a flight to KBMG, the Monroe County Airport in Bloomington, Indiana, which apparently was its new home base. It arrived about 2 p.m., sat on the ground for about 2 hours, and flew again for a little over an hour, performing the maneuvers. On Monday, it flew for about 4.5 hours, with a 1.5-hour break in the middle. It flew to a couple of local airports, doing mostly landings. On Tuesday, it was more of the same, flying for 5 hours with another 1.5-hour break in the middle. On Wednesday, the aircraft departed Bloomington at about 1 p.m., stopped at 2:30 p.m. for about an hour and a half, and then took off for KGEZ, which is Shelbyville, Indiana. Now, Shelbyville is a non-towered airport, and there's no live ATC.net receiver in the area, so we have no record of the radio communications for that flight. The main runway, runway 1 and runway 19, is 5,000 feet long and has a field elevation of 800 feet. The traffic pattern is 800 feet AGL or 1,600 feet MSL. The weather at the time was benign. The AWOS report for 4:53 p.m., about 7 minutes after the crash, was winds at 280 at 9, visibility 10, sky clear, temperature 7, dew point 2, altimeter 3000. So weather doesn't appear to have been a factor in any way. The accident aircraft first approached Shelbyville Airport from the southeast and crossed overhead the field at about 2,450 feet, or about 850 feet above pattern altitude. It was doing 116 knots at the time, a nice reasonable speed for joining the pattern. After crossing overhead the field, it made a descending right turn to make a teardrop entry to join the downwind for left traffic for runway 1. It was a little fast on final at 91 knots as it reached 300 feet AGL, the last data point for that approach. Typically, a Cirrus should be at about 80 knots at that point. Note that airspeed and ground speed would have been virtually the same, as the reported wind was a direct crosswind to the runway. After what was either a low approach or a touch and go, we can't be sure which, the aircraft climbed out somewhat fast. At about 400 feet AGL, it was at 117 knots. Typically at that altitude, I'd be closer to 90 knots in the climb, as it would get me to the minimum altitude for using the CAPS parachute much more quickly. The aircraft flew a left traffic pattern, leveling off at 1,750 feet on downwind. It got up to 140 knots when it was midfield downwind, which is very fast for flying in the traffic pattern. At that point, I'd target to be somewhere between 105 and 110 knots at the most. I beamed the numbers, I would reduce power, add flaps 50%, and descend at 100 knots, and descend at about 500 feet per minute. On base, Cirrus says we should add full flaps and fly at 90 knots. When this aircraft began turning base, it was 109 knots, about 10 knots faster than it should have been on downwind. On base, the aircraft ground speed was at 101 knots, but it would have had a 9-knot tailwind, so it was finally close to the target true airspeed of 90 knots. On final, as the aircraft reached 300 feet AGL, it was at 83 knots, fairly close to the target true airspeed of 80 knots. After another low approach or touch and go, again, we don't know which one it was for sure, the aircraft began climbing out again, though at a much lower speed than the previous climb out. It was at 102 knots at 600 feet AGL, which gives a fairly good climb rate. It was at 88 knots at about 1,700 feet. So far, so good. But then it started to slow as it leveled out, as it started its left crosswind turn. Now, that's a bad sign, as typically an aircraft accelerates somewhat as it levels off. At 1,800 feet, it was at 79 knots. It got to a peak altitude of almost 1,900 feet and then started a slow descent on the crosswind. Over the next minute, the ground speed was mostly in the 60s and 70s, but it was flying into a direct headwind, so that actual true airspeed on crosswind was more likely in the 70s and low 80s. As the aircraft reached 1,400 feet, or about 600 feet AGL, it turned to a left downwind. However, it was a much wider downwind than before, about 2 miles west of the runway. The last data point, as the aircraft was headed southbound, was recorded at 1,200 feet, or about 400 feet AGL, at 87 knots. The aircraft landed in a cornfield and was consumed by fire. Now, this accident has all of the hallmarks of a partial engine failure. You may recall that in episode 262, that our guest Tom Turner talked about a study in Australia that showed that partial power loss is 3 times more likely than complete engine failure. It also showed that serious injury or death occurred more frequently in partial power loss versus complete engine failures. With full power or no power, pilots know what to do. But the uncertainty of a partial power loss makes it harder for pilots to decide what to do. My client Marlon Dutra had a partial engine failure, and he said that the temptation to keep going is extremely high. He said he'd rather have a total loss and just pull the cap's parachute instead of having his head full of maybes. He also said to be careful with partial power losses. He said they look benign, but they will throw your brain in an overwhelming decision tree. Now, here's how I concluded these pilots had a partial engine failure. For the last 69 seconds of the flight, the aircraft descended a total of 600 feet. That translates to a descent rate of about 520 feet per minute. If the aircraft had run out of fuel, or if it had a complete engine failure, it would have been descending at more than 1,000 feet per minute. For this particular Cirrus, most Cirrus CSIP instructors train that the aircraft should be above 600 feet AGL in order to successfully use the cap's parachute system. This aircraft appears to have started having a partial power failure around the time it reached 1,800 feet at 79 knots. That was at 21:44:40 Zulu time. It reached 1,380 feet, or about 600 feet AGL, at 21:46:19 Zulu, and that means that it was above the altitude for using the cap's parachute for nearly 1 minute and 40 seconds from the time the aircraft started to slow. So this pilot and flight instructor had plenty of time to pull the cap's parachute, but they apparently instead decided to glide the aircraft down to a cornfield. Throughout the descent, the aircraft was clearly under control. It glided with partial power for about 2 minutes. There were no crazy turns such as you typically see when an aircraft is out of control. And the last data point showed the airplane at 87 knots, which is fairly close to the best glide speed of 92 knots. On Thursday, I heard from 3 different friends who knew the CFI and said that he had not trained with Cirrus for the CSIP instructor designation. A few years ago, Rick Beach of the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association presented a slide that showed that of the 18 fatal accidents that had occurred with a CFI on board, 16 of those accidents were with non-CSIP instructors. So the accident record for non-CSIP instructors is pretty poor. I'll talk more about CSIP certification later. First, let's talk about the Cirrus engine out procedures, and then why Cirrus pilots who choose not to pull the cap's parachute are at much greater risk if they glide down to a field than a Cessna pilot would be if they glide down to a field. Cirrus has several emergency checklists one would use in this situation. The first is the engine failure and flight checklist, which says 1. Best glide speed, establish. 2. Fuel selector, switch tanks. 3. Ignition switch, check both. 4. Fuel pump, boost. 5. Power lever, half open. 6. Mixture, idle cut off, then slowly advance until engine starts. It then says if engine does not start, perform engine air start, caps deployment, or emergency landing without power checklist as required. The engine air start checklist has a total of 12 steps, but I'm not going to go through them now. The final step says, if the engine will not start, perform emergency landing without power checklist. So now we have a choice to make. Are we going to use the emergency landing without power checklist and land in a field? Or are we going to use the CAPS deployment checklist and pull the parachute? And here's where the dilemma lies, especially if you're flying with a non-CSIP instructor who doesn't fully understand the trade-offs between these two choices. Let's first talk about primacy, which says that things you learn first, you remember best. If you didn't learn to fly in a Cirrus, and most pilots don't, you were taught that if the engine fails, that you would glide down and land in a field. Since that's what you learned first, primacy says that's what you tend to remember best. And it explains why some Cirrus pilots don't use the parachute when they should, and instead glide down to a field. And landing in a field might sound like a good option, but remember, for most non-Cirrus pilots, it's the only option. So of course it sounds good. We're all optimists and hope things will work out okay. So of course, that mythical smooth field where we're going to gracefully touch down gently in the ground sounds awfully attractive. If only that were always the case. Now let's talk about a Cessna pilot who's landing a Cessna 172 in a field. Stall speed in those aircraft with full flaps is around 39 knots. So if you manage to touch down at just slightly above stall speed, you're doing about 40 knots, not all that fast, and you have a reasonable expectation that things are going to turn out okay. Now let's look at a Cirrus. Stall speeds in most models are right around 60 knots. That's not surprising, as the FAA requires that stall speed not exceed 61 knots, and so to get the maximum performance out of their airplanes, Cirrus has gone right up to the limit when they designed the stall speed into the planes. Now imagine that you're landing a Cirrus in a field and that you've managed to touch down just above stall speed at around 60 knots. That's 20 knots faster or 50% greater than the speed at which a Cessna pilot might touch down in a field. Now 50% doesn't sound like a lot, but let's look at the physics of what's happening. Kinetic energy is directly proportional to the mass of the object and to the square of its velocity. And energy is what we have to dissipate in a crash. And it's your body that's going to be absorbing a lot of that energy in a crash. Since a Cirrus touching down in a field is 50% faster than a Cessna, we have to multiply 1.5 times 1.5 to get the difference in energy. And that comes out to 2.25. So if we crash a Cirrus in a field, our body is going to be subject to 2.25 or nearly 2.5 times the energy imparted on the Cessna pilot's body. Frankly, most of the time I fly, I'd prefer to be in a Cirrus. But if I had to land in a field, I would prefer to be in a Cessna and not a Cirrus, because there would be much less energy to dissipate in the crash. Fortunately, Cirrus pilots have a much better option than landing in a field, and that's pulling the CAPS parachute. Let's look at the physics again, this time when pulling the parachute. If we pull the parachute, we'll be descending at roughly 15 knots. Contrast that with putting a Cirrus into a field at 60 knots and coming to an abrupt stop because you hit something in the field. 60 knots is 4 times the speed of 15 knots. Since energy is a function of the velocity squared, we square 4 to find the difference. 4 times 4 is 16, so if we hit something in the field while touching down at 60 knots, we'll have to dissipate 16 times the energy that we would feel if the aircraft touched down under the CAPS parachute. Or if we were a little faster, landing at the field at perhaps 75 knots, that's a 5 times difference versus using the parachute, and we'd have to dissipate 25 times the energy if we landed in the field at 75 knots versus coming down under the parachute. Now imagine that I punched you really hard in the shoulder. It's going to hurt. Now imagine you got hit 25 times harder. Now that would result in a lot of broken bones and possibly death. So as you can see, the parachute is a much safer option after an engine failure, and landing in a field is fraught with problems. At one point, Rick Beach of the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association analyzed all of the fatal accidents that occurred in Cirrus aircraft in which the parachute was not pulled, and he concluded that fully a third of those pilots would have survived if they had only pulled the parachute. Here's another way of looking at it. Imagine you were driving an SUV across a field at 85 miles an hour, which would be a little over 70 knots. That would be a very rough ride in an SUV. Now think about the size of the tires on the SUV. And now think about the size of those small tires on a Cessna or Cirrus. And now you can see that the ride through the field in an airplane is going to be much worse than the ride in the SUV, simply because the tires are so small. And because they are so small, it's more likely that they'll get stuck in a ditch or a groundhog hole and bring the aircraft to an immediate stop. And that's the last thing you want to do when touching down in a field. Ideally, you want to be able to decelerate the plane over the longest possible distance to dissipate the energy slowly. If instead you have a sudden stop, your body is going to have to dissipate all of that energy suddenly, and you're more likely to get hurt or die. For my first few years as a Cirrus instructor, I didn't understand the physics of landing in a field versus pulling the parachute. And if I had had an engine failure back then, there's a chance I might have tried to land in a field. However, I was lucky to attend a seminar taught by Luke Lyson, a high-time Cirrus pilot, who was one of the co-founders of the Flight Academy Flight School near Seattle. After giving an explanation that was somewhat similar to what I've just told you, he said the choice for him about when to use the parachute was very simple. He said, unless I happen to be over an airport when the engine fails, I'm going to pull the parachute. Now, that's a very simple decision model, which is easy to act upon. You don't have to hem and haw and wonder whether or not to pull the parachute. If you can't get the engine restarted and there's not an airport below you, pull the parachute. But if you're flying a Cirrus and your flight instructor is not a CSIP instructor, they're not going to know things like this. And this is just one of many areas where the nuances of flying a Cirrus are different and why you want to get Cirrus instruction from a CSIP. And by the way, the same applies to any specialized aircraft. When someone comes to me and they want me to teach them in their Mooney, I always refer them to the local Mooney expert. Same thing for a Bonanza. I send them to someone who specializes in those aircraft. Because I don't specialize in them, and I don't know the nuances of flying them. And I'm sure as heck not going to pretend that I know how to fly these planes and hope that I can learn fast enough while I'm in the airplane. That's just not a responsible way to give flight instruction. To get a CSIP certification, a CFI needs to spend a week in Cirrus in Knoxville, going through extensive ground training and flight training. Cirrus aircraft are more complex than the average single-engine aircraft, and in those 40 hours of concentrated training, CFIs learn a lot about the nuances of teaching and remaining safe in a Cirrus. Legally, of course, any CFI can teach in a Cirrus, and I've seen a number of non-CSIP CFIs on online forums scoff at the idea that they could possibly benefit from CSIP training. Obviously, there's no way for them to know what they don't know. But any pilot buying a Cirrus should make sure they're learning from a Cirrus CSIP instructor. Otherwise, you're putting yourself at greater risk. Now, just before I finished writing this episode, I learned that there was another engine failure on the same day on Wednesday. It happened to November 901 Kilo Sierra, a 1985 Cessna 172. I learned about it on Facebook, where I just happened to see a photo of the airplane sitting in a field. I could not see any damage at all to the airplane, and the comments said that the pilot walked away uninjured. From FlightAware.com, I can see that the 172 took off from the Lakeland Airport and had only been in the air for about 12 minutes. As it reached about 3,000 feet, it leveled off, its airspeed decreased, and it started a descent that averaged between 650 and 700 feet per minute. It glided for about 4 minutes before touching down on the field. For a Cessna pilot, it was a good outcome. However, it was also the only choice available to the pilot. Sadly, the pilots in Shelbyville had another choice in the Cirrus to pull the parachute, but chose not to use it and rode the plane down to the field. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around. You can